On April 16, 2014, an emergency call center operator in South Korea received a distress call from a child. The child was inside a ship that was routinely heading toward Jeju Island in South Korea. On board were 476 passengers, most of them students and teachers on a school trip. The operator asked the child to hand the phone to the captain, because if the ship was really sinking, why hadn't an adult called for help? At that moment, most of the passengers weren't even aware of the danger. When the ship began to tilt, some children screamed with excitement. But soon it became clear that disaster was inevitable, and that was when true panic began. In just a few minutes, the massive 6,800-ton ship sank beneath the waters. Around 300 students, including the child who made the distress call, drowned. This tragedy shook the entire nation to its core. Everyone was asking the same questions. How could this happen? Who was responsible? The first to be blamed was, of course, the crew. When the ship began to sink, the captain had ordered passengers to remain in their cabins. Meanwhile, he and some crew members fled the ship, abandoning the children to die. The current president of South Korea declared that this behavior was equivalent to murder. The captain was sentenced to life in prison. The Coast Guard was also heavily criticized for its slow and incompetent response. But the most shocking truth emerged as the investigation progressed. The ship was twice as heavy as it should have been. It had been illegally modified to increase its cargo capacity, because more cargo meant more profit. The public erupted in anger. Someone had prioritized profit over safety, and soon everyone was saying the same thing. The owners of the ship had to be held accountable. But here was the problem. In South Korea, finding the real owners behind giant corporations was never easy. Family conglomerates controlled vast networks of subsidiaries. It was often impossible to tell who truly held the power. Some families had become so wealthy they were practically untouchable. Time and time again, they escaped punishment, grew their fortunes, and increased their power. And so, today's story examines three of South Korea's most powerful families. Families so influential that many people say they are the ones who truly run the country. South Korea's economy is often described as a true success story. In the 1950s, after the Korean War, it was one of the poorest countries in the world. But today, it has become the 13th largest economy globally. The secret behind this rapid rise was an export-driven economy and family-run conglomerates known as chaebols. Chaebols are essentially vast business empires run and controlled by families. After the war, South Korea's military dictators provided these family companies with capital to rebuild the country's key industries. Over time, they expanded into technology, finance, and manufacturing. Within a few decades, South Korea had transformed into an industrial giant, a miracle the public called the miracle on the Han River. The nation's largest corporations, Samsung, LG, Hyundai, were all family-controlled. Chaebols held much of the nation's wealth. Samsung alone accounted for a massive portion of South Korea's economy. In 2024, Bloomberg Economics estimated that Samsung would make the largest economic contribution in its history, responsible for nearly half of the country's economic growth. This immense wealth translated into immense power. Chaebol families developed very close ties with the government. They received subsidies, tax breaks, and special privileges. Almost all politicians relied on chaebols for support and advice. For decades, chaebols were hailed as the main architects of South Korea's economic miracle. But the 1997 Asian financial crisis tested their power. 13 of the 30 largest chaebols went bankrupt. This exposed the dangers of an economy so dependent on just a handful of companies. More and more South Koreans began to fear the dominance of these conglomerates. Over the years, the public watched as chaebol families became embroiled in endless scandals, embezzlement, bribery, labor law violations, and even health crises. Yet the government continued to treat them with leniency and favoritism. Public anger grew. In December 2014, Korean Air's Vice President Harter sparked national outrage in what became known as the nut rage incident. The trigger? A flight attendant had served her macadamia nuts in a bag instead of on a plate. Enraged, Cho screamed, insulted the staff, summoned the chief flight attendant, and demanded he kneel to apologize. She even ordered the plane to return to its gate. The chief flight attendant was fired on the spot. If you're not Korean, this might sound ridiculous, but in South Korea, it ignited fury. It was a symbol of the arrogance and entitlement of chaebol heirs. The public exploded in anger, on social media and in the streets. Korean Air initially tried to downplay the incident, even suggesting Cho had the authority to discipline staff. But no one believed it. By then, the public was already fed up with the shameless behavior of the Korean Air family. Other scandals involving Cho's siblings and father only fueled the outrage. In the end, Cho broke down in tears, apologized, and resigned. She was later convicted of violating aviation law and abusing her power. Though she faced up to 15 years in prison, she received just a 12-month sentence and served only 5 months, thanks to a reduced sentence. The chaebol's influence reached every level of government, even the very top. In the 2012 presidential election, one of the main debates was how to limit their power. Park Geun-hye, daughter of former dictator Park Chung-hee, became South Korea's first female president. Many feared she would allow business as usual. After all, her father had been one of the architects of the chaebol system. At first, Park promised reforms, but after the Sewol ferry disaster, public outrage grew unbearable. Investigators revealed that the ferry's owners, the Yu family, were at the root of the tragedy. President Park vowed to bring them to justice. What followed was the largest manhunt in South Korean history. The military and 10,000 police officers stormed Yu's religious sect headquarters, but he was nowhere to be found. Weeks later, his decomposed body was discovered in a field, surrounded by expensive Italian clothes, liquor bottles, and one of his books. The cause of death was never determined. Evidence showed that inspectors had taken bribes from Yu's company to overlook the ferry safety issues. One of the reasons the ship was overloaded was a marble art gallery Yu had insisted on adding to display his own work. Ultimately, one man's greed sank the Sewol, killing hundreds. The scandal only deepened public mistrust of chaebols and the government. Protesters demanded accountability and even the president's removal. In 2016, another massive corruption scandal erupted, this time implicating Park Geun-hye directly. She had received huge bribes and favors from chaebols, particularly Samsung, in exchange for government support. Samsung donated $36 million to a foundation run by Park's close friend, and in return, she approved a controversial merger that gave the Samsung family more control over their empire. Park was impeached, becoming the first South Korean president removed from office. She was sentenced to 24 years in prison and fined $17 million. Samsung's de facto leader, Lee Jae-yong, was also arrested and sentenced to 2 years in prison. But just a year later, Lee was pardoned because, as even President Moon Jae-in admitted, the critics are right about Lee's crimes, but the country needs him. Samsung was too important to fail. Lee's father had also been convicted of corruption in the 1990s but never spent a single day in jail. Pardons, it seemed, were a family tradition. In 2022, 70% of the public supported Lee's release, fearful of economic stagnation without him. Today, Lee remains the head of Samsung Electronics and is South Korea's richest man. Shockingly, even Park Geun-hye was pardoned after serving just 5 years, this time in the name of national unity. Despite public frustration with corruption, chaebol families remain deeply attractive to many South Koreans. Their companies offer salaries far higher than ordinary firms, and every year, over 200,000 applicants compete for jobs at Samsung alone. But as long as South Korea's richest families continue to control such a massive share of the economy, the question remains, is true reform ever possible?
Shell was a Korean word for massive corporations owned by powerful families. The arrogance and power of the rich fueled anger and despair in society.
우리를 도와주세요. 배가 가라앉고 있어요.